There are some sounds that never leave you, not because they're loud, but because they arrive in silence. On the first morning of April in the quiet valleys of Oregon, Clara Hayes heard such a sound. It wasn't the song of a bird or the creak of an old barn door. It was something smaller, something fragile, a faint, trembling cry hidden somewhere in the grass. She stopped walking. The fog drifted low over the pasture, and the only movement was her breath misting in the cold. Again, that sound, weak, desperate, like a heartbeat without a body. Clara knelt, parting the weeds with her hands. And there he was, a tiny lynx kitten, no bigger than a pair of gloves. His fur was soaked, tangled with burrs and mud. His eyes, impossibly blue, squinted up at her with terror. When he tried to hiss, the sound barely made it past his throat, a puff of air, too tired to mean danger. Every textbook she had read told her the same thing: never touch wildlife. But textbooks don't account for the moment your heart decides for you. She took off her jacket, scooped him up gently, and pressed him close to her chest. He was so light she could barely feel his weight, only the wild drumming of a terrified heart. As she walked back toward the farmhouse, the wind rose through the pines, and for a brief second, she wondered if the forest itself was watching her steal one of its own. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and old wood smoke. Her grandfather Henry sat at the table mending a fishing net, his silver hair glowing in the morning light. When Clara stepped in, soaked and shivering, he looked up, ready to scold her for tracking mud again. But the words froze in his throat when he saw what she carried. "Well," he said softly, "that's no house cat." Clara nodded, unfolding her jacket. The little creature blinked at the warmth, a tiny ghost of the wilderness dropped into their world. Henry leaned forward, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You've brought home trouble," he murmured, "but I suppose trouble's how most good stories begin." He found an old wool blanket and a cardboard box, set it beside the stove, and watched as Clara began cleaning the mud from its fur. When she was done, the kitten looked almost royal, its coat shimmering in shades of ash and rust. "What will you call him?" Henry asked. "Ash," she said after a moment, "because he looks like something that survived a fire." Henry smiled. "Fitting, but remember, Clara, wild things don't stay where it's safe for long." She only nodded, though she didn't quite believe him. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of care: morning feedings, gentle baths. Nights spent dozing in the old rocking chair, Ash curled up on her lap, his purr louder than the ticking of the kitchen clock. He was the smallest thing she had ever protected, and somehow he made her feel stronger than she'd ever been. Henry watched quietly from the porch, pretending to read his newspaper. He'd been a ranger once, he knew what was coming. But he let her learn the lesson the way all people do, by loving something she couldn't keep. By late May, the kitten had doubled in size. His eyes had turned gold, bright, intelligent, always moving. He stalked shadows across the floor, pounced on the edges of blankets, and when he tired himself out, he'd leap into Clara's lap, flop down like a spoiled prince, and let out a sigh that sounded far too human. He'd fall asleep with his head resting on her knee, belly exposed, purring as if the entire world fit inside that tiny farmhouse. For Clara, it did, but the wild is patient. It waits in silence until it's ready to be remembered. One night the waiting ended. Rain hammered the roof, the wind howled through the pines, and somewhere outside the latch of the porch gate broke loose. Clara woke to the storm's roar and to the emptiness beside her. The blanket was cold. The box overturned. Ash, no answer. She ran outside barefoot, the mud cold against her feet, her flashlight slicing through sheets of rain. Branches cracked overhead, her voice broke against the wind. Then, between flashes of lightning, she saw him crouched beneath a pine, a small silhouette against the wild. She fell to her knees, calling his name. He turned. For a moment their eyes met, hers full of fear, his full of something else. Something ancient. It wasn't the gaze of a lost pet. It was the gaze of something that remembered what it was: free, untamed, home. When she reached out, he didn't run, but he didn't come either. He simply watched her, the storm reflecting in his golden eyes, and in that silence Clara understood what her grandfather had meant. Some bonds aren't meant to hold. They're meant to prepare you for letting go. She lifted him gently, carried him back inside, and held him until the thunder faded. But even as his heartbeat slowed against her chest, she knew part of him had already returned to the forest. Summer came soft and green. Ash grew strong. He climbed the branches of the enclosure Henry built, leapt from stump to stump, and practiced the silent patience of a hunter. Clara's pride battled with her sorrow. Every day he looked less like the fragile kitten she had rescued and more like the wild thing he was meant to be. Henry finally said what she feared most: "It's time to call the sanctuary." Clara stared at him, her throat tightened. "I can take care of him. You already have," he said gently. "But care isn't the same as captivity. The next morning, a truck rolled down the gravel road, leaving a wake of dust and inevitability. A man in uniform stepped out from the State Wildlife Center. He spoke kindly, told her Ash was healthy, ready for the final stage of rehabilitation before release. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you've done everything right. But the hardest part of loving a wild thing is knowing when to stop." Clara nodded, unable to speak. She opened the gate. Ash padded toward her, silent, confident. She expected him to resist the crate, to claw or cry, but he didn't. He looked up at her once, then walked inside on his own. The sound of the latch closing was louder than thunder. Henry rested a hand on her shoulder. "You did good, kid." She watched the truck disappear down the long road until the dust settled and the silence came back, a silence that filled every corner of the house. The days after were strange. The rocking chair creaked but no longer purred. The floorboards stayed clean. There were no half-eaten socks, no curious eyes peeking around the corners. The house had grown larger and emptier. Clara tried to focus on her studies again. She wrote essays about ecosystems, but each paragraph felt hollow, as if the words had lost their heartbeat. One evening, Henry found her staring at the empty enclosure. "He's out there," he said, "probably chasing his first rabbit right now." She smiled faintly. "I hope he remembers me," Henry chuckled. "Wild things remember what matters. They just don't come back for long." Autumn painted the forest gold and crimson. The air turned crisp. Leaves crunched beneath their boots as they walked the field. Life had settled into quiet rhythm again. Then one evening in late October, under a rising hunter's moon, Henry paused on the porch, his old eyes narrowing toward the tree line. "Clara," he whispered, "look." At the edge of the woods, a shadow stood still among the silver light. Broad shoulders, tufted ears, tail low. A lynx, sleek, strong, and utterly wild. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that shape. Ash, the name left her lips as a whisper, and across the distance, the creature lifted its head, those same golden eyes catching the light. He didn't move closer, he didn't make a sound, but when he turned his head slightly, the moon glinted off a small scar on his left ear, a scar she had bandaged months ago. Her hand went to her mouth. He remembers, for a heartbeat, two worlds met, the tame and the wild, the girl who loved and the creature she set free. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, Ash turned and slipped back into the forest. The grass swayed, the shadows closed, and he was gone. Clara stood there for a long time, the cold air brushing her cheeks, the moonlight washing the tears from her face. Henry smiled beside her, his voice barely a murmur. "Looks like he found his way home," she nodded. He always knew where home was, but deep inside she realized so did she, because loving Ash hadn't just been about saving him. It had been about saving something in herself, the part that still believed kindness mattered, even when it hurt. Weeks later, she wrote in her journal, "Maybe love isn't a leash or a cage or a promise to stay. Maybe love is the courage to open the door, to let what you cherish walk away, and trust the world will be kind enough to meet it halfway." That winter, Clara applied for an internship with the State Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. When they asked why, she smiled and said, "Because I once raised a wild heart and it raised me right back." The interviewer laughed softly. "You sound like someone who understands letting go." Clara nodded. "It's the hardest kind of love, but it's the only kind that lasts." The following spring, the fields bloomed again. The forest stood quiet, alive, patient, and every morning, as Clara opened the porch door, she'd pause for just a second, listening. Not because she expected him to return, but because the silence now sounded full, as if part of him still lived there in the wind, the trees, the soft rustle of leaves. And sometimes, when the dawn broke just right, she could almost hear it, the low, steady rumble of a purr, rolling like distant thunder across the valley. Because some hearts, no matter how far they roam, never stop echoing the place where they first learned what love meant.